Hello, this is the video for Chapter 19, all about politics, populists, and progressives. The essential question for this video is how and why did progressive era reformers seek to address the problems of industrial America, and to what extent did they succeed? So this time period after the Civil War, Americans are trying to uh, shake off the bad parts of the Civil War and embrace a lot of the industrial growth. Um, in one way, we have um, politicians who are trying to use the military service of the Civil War as a way to get elected. Um, but oftentimes, this period is known as the Gilded Age for its corruption. When something is gilded, that means it's covered with a coating of gold, but on the inside, it's not gold; it's fake. And so that's kind of what it's supposed to be for America. On the outside, things look like it's good, but on the inside, if you look deeper, things are decaying and poverty is growing and things are bad in America. Um, so, looking at some of the politics of this time period after Reconstruction, um, in 1881, President Garfield is takes office and is shot. He's shot and killed by a man who is upset he didn't get a job through patronage. Or patronage is where a politician gives someone a job because they help them get elected. Congress wants to um, try to combat patronage, and so passes what's called the Pendleton Civil Service Act, which says if you're going to work in a federal job, you have to pass a certain examination. So that means in order to work in the federal government, you have to have some capability. The vice president, Chester A. Arthur, he becomes president after Garfield is shot. And Arthur doesn't do much in his couple years as president. In 1884, Republicans and Democrats run for president again, and Grover Cleveland wins the presidency. Some Republicans view their nominee, James Blaine, as corrupt, and so he does not win. In Chapter 16, you learned about the Interstate Commerce Act, so we won't mention it here, but um, there's been a lot of problems with factories and businesses growing too much, and so we begin to see some um, movement from the government to restrict how much businesses can grow. This is a famous scandal during Grover Cleveland's presidency or his run for president. There was a suspicion that he had fathered an illegitimate child, and so the Republicans, trying to make fun of him, came up with a rhyme that said, "Ma, ma, where's my pa?" While Cleveland um, supporters responded with their own rhyme saying, "Gone to the White House, ha, ha, ha." So look at that. There's even scandals in presidential elections 130 years ago. Now, in 1888, um, Cleveland runs for president again, but he loses to Benjamin Harrison. Um, During Harrison's presidency, they pass a Sherman Antitrust Act, and this is supposed to stop combinations of businesses to restrain trade. So what that basically means is they're going to try to stop monopolies from happening. However, it's very difficult to prove that a company is creating a monopoly, and so it wasn't really enforced. Not very many businesses were stopped from creating monopolies because of this law. One thing President Harrison did advocate for when he was president was the Lodge Bill. The Lodge Bill would what it would do is it would um, appoint federal supervisors to watch over elections to make sure they're fair, to make sure that Southern states weren't doing things to take voting rights away from African Americans. However, Southern Democrats did not support this. People who liked political machines didn't like this. It could have been useful for protecting Black voting rights. However, swing voters did not like this bill. And so in 1892, Democrats voted against Harrison, and Grover Cleveland was reelected. He's the only president to have two non-consecutive terms. So there was Cleveland, and then Harrison, and then Cleveland, Grover Cleveland again. Now, when we get to the late 1880s, early 1890s, rural voters are beginning to organize politically to try to fight for their interests, believing that the political parties on the East Coast are kind of abandoning them. Eventually, they create the political party called the People's Party, otherwise known as the Populists. And they want to have more protection of ordinary Americans, that they believe businesses and the government have forgotten about everyday Americans and that their rights are not being protected. And so in Omaha, Nebraska, they create their platform, which is their set of beliefs. So they want things like public ownership of railroads. Railroads were one of the most notorious of entities that were taking away power from farmers in the Great Plains. And so people thought that if the government owned these railroads, the people would be protected. They wanted to protect land from being taken over by businesses, especially railroads. They wanted an income tax on the rich, and they wanted to use bimetallism for monetary policy. See, at this time, our metal was based off of gold. If you had a $1 bill, that meant somewhere in a bank there was $1 worth of gold that dollar bill represented. Now, the thing is, all the gold was controlled by businesses and banks. If normal people had any metal money, they had silver. And so the people thought that if silver and gold was used for our money, then the people would have more power. And you can see in some of these early elections, the green is the populist. We do see some beginnings of movement, especially in the Great Plains. So this is going to lead to dramatic changes in the 1890s, especially when the 1890s leads to a recession, or in other words, a panic. The stock market crashes in 1893, and Americans are afraid that labor strikes would make things even worse. And so there are thousands of people without jobs. One result of this is something called the Coxey's Army. There was a businessman named Jacob Coxey who said the government should hire unemployed men to fix America's roads. So basically, this is kind of like the first New Deal program. And hundreds of people marched to Washington to get this happening. However, Coxey was arrested, and Cleveland was not willing to do this. He was not willing to do really much with a panic. He did not support bimetallism. He did not support having the government interfere with the economy very much. And Cleveland is going to be gone very soon. The Democrats, along with Cleveland, are losing power. However, they do gain more power in the South. Southern Democrats believe that their party was for white men only. They did not like populists who were trying to get black voters to join their side. Democrats in the South at this time tried to take voting powers away from African Americans. They would use things like poll taxes, so a special tax in order to vote, and literacy tests as a way to register to vote. These are all designed to take power away from African Americans. And it was allowed with the court case Williams versus Mississippi. This led to voter turnout dropping dramatically. Now, in 1896, a very important presidential election came to a head. And so Cleveland is kind of discarded because he doesn't believe in bimetallism. He doesn't believe in populist ideas. So the Democrats instead nominate William Jennings Bryan, who is a populist. And the Democrats believe that the populists will join the Democratic Party now. William Jennings Bryan gives what's called the Cross of Gold speech, where he goes after the gold standard for money. And he says mankind should not be crucified upon a cross of gold, so they should not be stuck to it, leading to their death. Republicans said that William Jennings Bryan was an anarchist, and they nominated this man, William McKinley, instead. He wanted the gold standard, he wanted high tariffs, and he's one of the first presidents to get money for his election using corporate donations. And eventually, McKinley would win. So bimetallism is dead. However, during this time, even though the populists do not win the presidential election, different states are passing populist ideas. Some states are turning to a direct primary where the people get to vote on who their nominee is for an election. Congress passes the 17th Amendment that said that senators are now chosen by the popular vote, by people, not by state legislatures. Now, in 1901, McKinley won another election for a second term. However, very soon after that, McKinley was shot and killed while in Buffalo, New York. His vice president, Theodore Roosevelt, is sworn as president. And Roosevelt was a populist president who would lead to progressive reform. There he is with an axe for some reason at the White House. Now, Republican presidents before him were not willing to go after corporations, but Roosevelt was. In 1902, coal workers went on strike, and the business owners refused to even negotiate with the unions. And so Roosevelt said, hey, big coal companies, if you don't even negotiate, we're going to nationalize your company. So basically, we're going to take over your company and we're going to run it from and take it away from you, basically. And this showed that when strikes were within the public good, that the president could get involved. He wanted the Elkins Act, which would prohibit rebates. Basically, rebates are when they would give coupons to really big business customers and charge high prices for small farmers or small businesses. And under Roosevelt's Justice Department, they mounted antitrust suits, meaning they're going to claim companies are creating monopolies and try to break them apart. Teddy Roosevelt believed that some businesses were creating monopolies that were hurting the people, and he was willing to take them out. He did think that there were some businesses that were okay to combine and create a monopoly as long as they weren't hurting the people, and he would make sure that they would continue to be good trusts by tying them up with restraint or regulations. Roosevelt wants what's called a square deal for Americans. When you hear square deal, think of like fair and square. He wants things to be fair for Americans and that the government and businesses don't have too much power. And in 1904, Roosevelt wins his election for another term in office. Roosevelt is going to become famous for setting aside national parks, national monuments. He was the first president to eat with an African American man in the White House, which made many Southern Democrats very upset. But in 1908, he decided not to run for re-election. Instead, he convinced the Republican Party to support his best friend, William Howard Taft. And Roosevelt believed that Taft would carry on his policies. We can see that in this cartoon here, where Roosevelt is leaving and he's giving his policies, like his baby, to the babysitter, who is Taft. But Taft is not as progressive as Roosevelt is. Despite Taft not being very progressive, other states around the U.S. are pushing towards progressivism, like Wisconsin. Robert La Follette, the governor there, led the Wisconsin idea, where the government intervenes with the economy. They stop lobbying and give more power to the people instead of more power to businesses like railroads. There's Robert La Follette yelling at people in Wisconsin. All around America, progressives are also fighting for what's called the settlement movement and trying to help people who are impoverished in big cities, like going after the child labor issues. In many places around the country, it was very common for children to go and work in factories or in mines or in very dangerous working conditions. And so some progressives fought to end child labor. Lewis Hine was a photographer who went to factories and mines, took pictures of children, and tried to show the rest of the country what was really going on. And progressives were able to end child labor in some states, but in some southern states, these labor laws were not enacted until the 1930s or 1940s. Muller versus Oregon created a law that limited women's workday to 10 hours. What that means is that if they work more than 10 hours, they get paid overtime, and women's rights supporters liked this ruling a lot. And progressives also fought for workmen's compensation, which means if you get injured on the job, the business was responsible for some of your healthcare needs. Here you can see some child workers in factories. Now, while progressives fought for more power to the people, most of the organized progressive movements were focused on issues of white Americans. They were not very focused on racial equality. We had talked in a previous chapter about Plessy versus Ferguson that allowed segregation and Jim Crow laws. And so some Black progressives tried to find plans for seeking Black equality, like Webb Du Bois, who said that the talented 10th, the most successful and most elite African Americans, should find new strategies and find ways for the African American community to gain more power in society. He advocated for full voting rights, for ending segregation, ending poll taxes, ending literacy tests, and he demanded equality now. He advocated using protests and going to court when state governments were doing something illegal. He and others created the NAACP, or the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, and they fought for Black equality by suing states or businesses. There is some conflict with progressives and some labor unions. Labor unions at this time wanted to gain power through strikes by negotiating with their workers, not really going through politics. But by the time we get to the 1900s and 1910s, they begin to see that political action is an easier way when state governments are not supportive of strikes. Now, in 1912, we have another election, and Teddy Roosevelt is really upset that Taft has led the country to be more conservative rather than more progressive. So Roosevelt decides to run for president in 1912, and he expands his progressive policies in the New Nationalism Plan to include more rights for labor unions, a national minimum wage for women, and even women's suffrage, which was pretty um, extreme for the two political parties at the time. The Republicans had to decide, are they going to nominate Taft or Roosevelt? If you were more progressive, you would support Roosevelt. If you're more conservative, you'd support Taft. And fearing the progressive ways that Roosevelt is supporting, Republicans nominated Taft. Here you can see there's Teddyism, and Roosevelt wants to take the Republican Party and baptize them in Teddyism, but the other conservative Republicans are trying to stop them from doing it. Here you can see Taft is holding the Republican elephant by the tail. Roosevelt is upset, and so he decides to rebrand the Progressive Party as the Bull Moose Party. So we're going to have two candidates who are typically Republicans going against the Democratic candidate, Woodrow Wilson. Woodrow Wilson is also pretty progressive. He wants to preserve political and economic liberty, and he does not want to support African American rights. In fact, none of the parties really do much to support African American equality. I'm going to skip this video, but you can watch it on your own if you'd like. It kind of goes over the election of 1912. Here you can see the result of the video. Woodrow Wilson ends with a electoral landslide. However, if you look at the popular vote, Roosevelt and Taft, who are both Republicans, typically, if you add their votes together, they had over 7 million votes compared to Woodrow Wilson's 6 million votes. So if the Republicans would have just decided Roosevelt or Taft and neither created a third party, they would have won. So Wilson is elected president, and he believes that workers need the government to be stronger to work for them. So they create things like the 16th Amendment, which creates a progressive income tax. There is no national bank at this time because Wilson wants to lower tariffs. That's how the government is going to make more money, through a tax. And to control all this and control how much money is put out into the economy, Congress creates the Federal Reserve, which is a national banking system. So these reserve banks can issue currency. And if you look at a dollar bill today, you can see that at the very top it says Federal Reserve Note. And there is a reserve bank in Chicago, and it disperses money to banks in the Midwest area, and that's where we get our money from. Wilson believes that competition is very important for businesses, and so while the Sherman Antitrust Act did not do much to get rid of monopolies, they again create a new law called the Clayton Antitrust Act, which makes it easier for the businesses to be identified as a monopoly. Here you can see where the Federal Reserve controls different areas. So we are in Area number 7, out of Chicago. Wilson is willing to go after big businesses if he believes that it's not allowing competition to thrive. And that's it for this chapter. If you have any questions, please ask your teacher. Thank you.